like. When Jesus had crossed again in a boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came up, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He asked him urgently, "My daughter is near death. Come, lay your hands on her, so she may be healed and live." God went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Now a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she kept saying, if only I touch his clothes, I will be healed. At once the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus knew at once that power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease."
So we continue in our journey through Mark's gospel as we continue in chapter 5. Last week we were in the other side of the Sea of Galilee in Gentile territory. And as you just heard in Gary's reading, Jesus has now returned to the Jewish side, to Capernaum. Now, as we know, Mark is often moving breathlessly from one scene to another, and we heard that again this morning. Before I read the rest of the story, though, I want to point out one thing that is a favorite tool that Mark uses. Now, scholars call this intercalation, but it's known more as sandwiching. And basically what Mark does is he has two stories. He starts with one, which we might imagine as the piece of bread, and then he inserts the filling, another story in the middle before that second piece closes the scene. And you heard that already. We began with the story of Jairus coming and begging for the life of his little daughter. But Jesus is interrupted, and the woman with the hemorrhaging comes and encounters him in the midst of this crowd. But we're not clear, though, what is going to happen. The rest of the story has not been finished. And so we have these two stories gathered together. And Mark does this on purpose, and there's a number of different places in the Gospels where we find this. And the idea is that these two stories are not separate, but rather are brought together. They speak to each other as they speak to us. So I'm going to continue reading just where Gary left off in verse 35 and end the chapter through 43 as Jesus continues on and is making his way towards Jairus' house. And so while Jesus was still speaking, people came from the synagogue leader's house saying, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But Jesus, paying no attention to what they had said, told the synagogue leader, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue leader, where he saw noisy confusion and people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, Jesus said to them, "Why are you distressed and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they began to make fun of him. But he forced them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and his own companions and went into the room where the child was. And then, gently taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." The girl got up at once and began to walk around, for she was 12 years old. They were completely astonished at this. Jesus strictly ordered that no one should know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are some experiences in life that take us to the very edge of our ability to cope. For example, it might be the loss of a job and a livelihood. Or maybe it's the diagnosis of a serious disease. Or maybe the person you've shared your life with decides that the relationship is over. And of course, the death of a loved one likewise brings about these difficult times in life. All of these circumstances can push us to the limit of what we think we could possibly endure and survive. And we have a phrase for it. We call it being at the end of your rope. And I imagine we all have our own experience. And maybe we're suffering that right now. At one time or another, we have been in that situation where we feel like we can't hang on any longer. Well, our gospel lesson from the second part of Mark chapter 5 this morning introduces us to two different people who have reached the end of their respective ropes. The first we're introduced to is a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, but also a father whose daughter is at death's doorstep. And the second is a woman whose life has been destroyed by a chronic illness that she has suffered for more than 12 years. And so Mark's way of telling this story, his sandwiching of these two stories together, invites us both to compare and to contrast the characters in the stories and how Jesus responds to each of them. Now, Jairus, the synagogue leader, and this woman with the hemorrhage certainly have something in common, and that they're both victims of desperate circumstances, that they have no other place to turn, that without Jesus, it seems they have no hope for life or for a future. Otherwise, though, in many ways, their situations and their circumstances diverge widely. We, of course, recognize at first that Jairus is given a name, and we know that he has a respectable position as a leader in the local synagogue. And so he is a respected and known member of the community. We also know that he has enough prestige to come and to ask and to expect that Jesus will listen to him and will follow him back to his home where he lives with his family. And we know that presumption is not disappointed as Jesus immediately responds and is on his way to the man's house. On the other hand, the woman in the story can claim none of these privileges. She is not given a name here or later. We have no idea what her true name is. She also has apparently no position in society. Whatever resources she might have had, she has spent them on trying to cure her disease. She has no family apparently with her. She's out all on her own, seemingly having no connection to the community. There's decisions maybe that she has possibly, because of her circumstances, might not be welcomed in places of worship and be outcast from the world. Whereas Jairus comes and approaches Jesus face to face, expecting an answer from him, we're told that the woman instead comes in the midst of a large crowd jostling on their way to the synagogue leader's house, and that she comes from behind, reaching out her hand, not willing or able to even ask or speak to Jesus, but just with the hope and the faith that just by touching him, somehow she will be freed and made new. And she's not identified or has any at the beginning identification of who she is. But despite this wide disparity, Despite the huge difference between these two, we see in the presence of Jesus that the gap between them is bridged. That Jesus does not seem to see a difference between these two, and he is willing to enact God's kingdom in the presence of both of them. And in fact, I want to focus on two words here that I think in particular are important in this story. The first is the word daughter, and the second is the word faith. Now, daughter here, as we know, and probably our own culture as well, is not just an identifier of a family member, but it's also a term of endearment. Here it speaks of emotion and connection and relationship. And in these stories, it is even a word of new life for both of the women in the story. For the hemorrhaging woman, being called daughter in many ways is life-changing for her. And given her history of suffering for more than 12 years with this illness, we must wonder, when was the last time someone spoke to her in this way? When was the last time someone called her daughter? When someone invited her to be part of their family? We can imagine it had been a long, long time since she's heard these words. In fact, this woman in many ways is called daughter by Jesus, suggesting that perhaps in many ways what he's trying to do is invite her in to the new family that he's gathering. He shows her that someone cares for her, someone can see her and knows who she is, and reaches out with these words of comfort and relationship. And so we can imagine in the midst of the turmoil and the chaos of this huge crowd following Jesus as he makes his way into town, she is not only, as she reaches out, cured of her ailment, as she feels the disease in her body change, but she is also made whole again. She is welcomed. She is recognized by Jesus as part of his family and part of the community again. And so Jesus is stating a new identity for her, that she is indeed a child of Israel, a child of the covenant that God has made with God's people. And therefore she receives the promise and the blessing of the kingdom. She is one of God's children, and she is no longer excluded. Now, for the 12-year-old girl who we meet as the daughter of Jairus, that word daughter is a reminder, of course, that she has someone, in this case her father, to advocate for her. That as she lays near death at home, she is not on her own, but rather she's part of a larger relationship, a web of life, and someone is out there speaking for her and seeking health for her, someone who literally saves her life. And in many ways, Jesus comes and he deepens that relationship as we have this intimate moment where he tells everyone else to leave, all those who are wailing and mourning, gets them out of the house, and he comes into the girl's room. And it's just Jesus, the mother and the father, and his three companions, a small, intimate gathering. And we're told that Jesus takes the girl's hand, and he says those words in the Aramaic, Talitha cum, which is translated usually as little girl, arise or get up, as she does. But it was interesting this week, I read that the actual literal translation of that Talitha is not little girl, but it literally means little lamb. Jesus is there as the shepherd, finding the lamb who has been lost, who is near death, and calls her back. And yet again, she is also restored to new life. Hearing Jesus speak these words, I wonder what words of endearment we need to hear today. After all, we too are recipients of the inheritance of the promise of the covenant. We also receive the forgiveness and the wholeness, the healing and the peace of Christ. We too are children of God. And that's why when we read these stories, we listen again for those words speaking to us. What are those words of comfort and strength, of relationship and endearment that we need to hear as Jesus speaks? Now, the second word of significance I want to focus on briefly is the word faith, because that also is what ties these two together in our story. We begin with Jairus. Think about the obstacles he faced as he came and approached Jesus. He was a synagogue leader. He was well known in the community, and so far Jesus has not been very popular with the religious and the synagogue leaders. In fact, the last time in the story Jesus was in the synagogue in chapter 3, after he had healed the man with the withered hand, some of the leaders began to plot for Jesus' death. And so this is a risky proposition for Jairus. Also, word is getting out that Jesus is speaking about a new kingdom that is coming, that he is bringing about. And we can imagine for the political leaders, for the Romans, for King Herod, speaking of a new kingdom is a dangerous proposition. And yet in this moment, it seems that Jairus does not care about any of that. He is focused instead on his little daughter, whose life is slipping away. He's desperate, and he needs something new in his life. And so we're told he throws himself down at Jesus' feet, out in public, a radical and risky act for this leader of the synagogue. It's not dignified, it's not something anyone would expect him to do. But it seems he doesn't care at all at this point. Instead, he pleads with Jesus, please just come and lay your hands on my little daughter so that she may be healed. He has faith that just one touch from Jesus will indeed restore her to life. Now, the woman with the hemorrhage also, of course, has good reason not to approach Jesus. She's not even supposed to be there in the crowd, and yet she makes this bold attempt in the midst of this chaos, bumping into other people, pushing her way, determined to make her way to this man who she is convinced can bring her new life. She has no standing in the community, no right to be there, no one to protect her or watch out. But she too is desperate and out of options. All she cares about is this moment that she can reach out to the one who has come to usher in a new kingdom. And like Jairus, she too has faith that just one touch can bring wholeness and healing to her life. Now, both of these folks in the story, of course, are examples of steadfast and determined faith. They say, we don't care what everybody else thinks about this. We don't care about the repercussions. They know that Jesus can somehow bring healing to their lives. And I think when we see this scene this morning, it's important to remember that when we talk about faith, especially in the Gospels, it's not mostly about a list of beliefs that we subscribe to. It's not about certain ideas or understandings that we may have or books that we read, but rather faith is about trust in the Gospels. So in some ways, Jesus is saying here, my daughter, your faith has made you well. He's saying that your trust, that your loyalty, your bonding to me, your willingness to step forward, that is your faith. And that is what begun this new part of life in which you are healed. And so especially in Mark's gospel, as we'll continue on in the coming months, faith can also mean not letting any obstacles, such as even death or rejection or being sent out of the community, of not letting those defeat our hope in Jesus. Because as one commentator put it, it is Jesus himself who awakens the faith in these recipients. It is not some independent religious attitude. It's not some conviction that they're brought on from themselves, but rather Jesus' presence awakens this faith within them. And so whatever faith these two have come alive in the presence of Jesus in our story. Now, these last 2 weeks, we've talked about these different miracles, these works of Jesus. And as modern people, we do not fully understand how exactly these miracles work. We don't understand how this healing comes. But we do know that faith is involved here. We do know that God desires for wholeness and not for chaos, that God of love is at work in our world, and we're invited to approach and to look for it, as both Jairus and the woman today do. For that power of reaching and healing is present in our world, and Jesus invites us to see this new kingdom among us. I want to close with a brief story that is told by the author Gerald May. He talks about his early career as a doctor. He said he was in a deep depression because many of his patients were not being cured. They're not getting any better, even as he did his best to help them. He said in the middle of this difficult time, he was casually introduced to a faith healer who was at a conference in a nearby town. He writes this, he said, "I must confess that I did not believe in faith healers. I was deeply skeptical. But when we shook hands, this woman paused, holding my hand, and she said to me that she thought I was meant to be a healer too. But she said, I wouldn't take my dog to you because you think you are the one who does the healing." Gerald May writes that he was struck deep and well by this woman's words. He said, "I realized then that there is indeed some power greater than myself involved in healing, and that I was much better off cooperating with that power instead of trying to usurp it and use it on my own." And I think the same is true in the church. That as we listen to these stories, as we proclaim the healing power of Jesus, it's not up to us to do the healing. We are the witnesses, we are the instruments, we are the ones who speak and point towards the one who brings healing and hope to our lives. And so, friends, let us indeed be those witnesses. Let us be witnesses to the work that comes in Christ as Christ's kingdom is proclaimed yet again. Witnesses to the power that has come near. And so, friends, let us listen for those words of endearment and relationship. Let us speak those words of faith. For indeed, our faith has made us well and whole, and we are called to go out and proclaim that good news. To God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.